I liken the race between them as the race between the tortoise and the hare. China has been running very fast. India has been more deliberate in its economic championship. But I think in the end, the tortoise may well beat out the hare. Now, I've got 4 points along these lines that I just want to lay on the table here. Number one, China is in a secular slowdown of its economy. In other words, let's not focus on the cyclical changes, but on the secular changes. Its GDP growth has begun to decline over the last 10 years, and that's for a very particular reason. It's not because China is a mature economy and is getting old in terms of how long it's been an economic power. It's slowing down secularly because the Communist Party is continuing to strangle competition within the economy with the domination of state-owned enterprises and the nexus between the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned banks, where frankly, the banks pretend to lend money to the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned enterprises pretend to pay it back. And if you look at the non-performing loans on the bank's balance sheets, the numbers speak for themselves. Now, India has been highly variable in its growth rate, but it has begun to show, I think, with proper policies, that it can actually grow quite fast. Certainly in this decade, that record is clear. I think the challenge for India in its race with respect to China is to continue to open up the economy, let markets dictate prices, but at the same time making sure that there's infrastructure built and making sure that the remaining poverty in India is alleviated with proper policies. One area, second point, is the competition that takes place worldwide between Chinese enterprises and Indian enterprises. And I've done a lot of work on this matter. What you see is the state-owned enterprises in China, do a very good job in terms of outcompeting other firms, but they do so because they're heavily subsidized, as I mentioned before, not just because of loans, but outright subsidies from the government. In the end, while it has been paying off for the Chinese in the short term, in the end, I think Indian firms, which tend to be more privately oriented, less government intrusion in terms of ownership, will outcompete China. But as I say, going back to this tortoise and the hare analogy, India has got to continue to be steady in terms of allowing its enterprises overseas to outcompete China. And it has been doing so when you look at the data, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, and whether it's in Africa and Latin America. The third point I want to make is the sign of a healthy economy and a rapidly growing economy for the long run is how much foreign investors want to invest in the economies. And the numbers are quite striking when you compare the amount of foreign direct investment that has been going into China per GDP and the amount of foreign direct investment that has been going in India per GDP. If you go back to the 1990s, the FDI to GDP ratio for China was about 6%. It has been on a downward trend ever since. And last year, in 2019, that number was 1.1%. That's telling you how investors think about China. And it's telling you also about the policy framework that China has in place to attract foreign direct investment. The new foreign investment law in China, which took about 5 years to revise, is way below world-class standards in terms of treating foreign investors in a like-minded way as it does domestic investors. So there's a lot of policy and legal aspects to China's decline in the foreign direct investment to GDP ratio. With respect to India, it has started from a much lower ratio in the early 1990s, roughly less than 1%. For 2019, it was up to 1.1%. So you've got a downward trajectory in terms of FDI to GDP in China, and an upward trajectory, though more variable, in the case of India. That is an extraordinarily important point, I think, when we're looking at comparing India and China and what the policymakers in India need to focus on in terms of opening up the economy to foreign direct investment. The recent government has been making the right kinds of policy calls, but in my view, not enough. And if you want to win the race against China, we need to allow more foreign direct investment to come in to India. The fourth point I want to make is with respect to this Belt and Road Initiative that we're all fascinated with. Now, it's a very clever experiment, maybe even a plan on the part of the Chinese, but at its root, it is not an altruistic objective that China is following. The problem is, as I noted in my point number one, is because there are state-owned enterprises that dominate the economy of China, there's excess capacity. There's not enough people who want to buy internally in China the goods and the employees who are working at these big, large state-owned enterprises. So what the Belt Road Initiative really represents at its fundamental is exporting that excess capacity to neighboring countries around the world. And we can go through those country by country, and as you'll see, increasingly recipients of the countries for the Belt and Road Initiative investments are beginning to question whether or not it's actually in their best interest. But most importantly, when you're looking at the Belt Road Initiative on the part of China, it actually flies in the face of how China has done extraordinarily well over time in getting growth out of the economy as much as it can under a communist leadership. And that way that the Chinese have engaged in reforms has been through experimentation and incremental reforms, testing what works, what doesn't work. The case of the Belt Road Initiative is not experimental, it's not incremental, it's a one fell swoop, uniform plan across the economies that the Belt Road Initiative is being wheeled out to. And I think that will be perhaps where China, the Belt Road Initiative, will maybe become a bridge that's too far. So I think the two economies are in a race. I think there are great differences between the two of them. I think China is frankly on a downward trend, and I think it's up to India to embrace the kinds of policies that allow it to outcompete China, not just internally, domestically in the markets, but in third country markets, where I think India's firms are far more competitive with other global firms than Chinese firms. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. I think Belt and Road Initiative is clearly an important milestone